But that's the
Right.
extent of what they could have done, is say move. There is no
Hmm.
circumstance where that results in execution. Nowhere in the
Hmm.
US.
Right.
Have you ever heard the phrase, who watches the Watchmen?
Mondays with Mike. Okay, cool. Do you want to move on to Minneapolis?
Sure. Yeah, we could talk about that.
Great. Vance went to Minnesota. That area has been in an uproar since Renee Good was killed. Do you want to give a summary of the events that have been going on the past 3 weeks?
Sure. The very brief summary timeline of events is that there was a who claimed that there's a bunch of fraud going on in Minnesota with child care centers. And in response, there was an uproar on the right demanding investigations and more enforcement. There is a heightened level of enforcement, of law enforcement in Minnesota right now, in part because of that sort of moral panic over the fraud from the child care centers where they were allegedly applying for money from the federal government, and that some of the child care centers weren't actually providing child care. That's the allegation. Anyways, in response to those allegations, huge surge of immigration enforcement in Minneapolis. Thousands of officers, just way more people, law enforcement people than almost any other part of the country when you look at, per capita compared to the population. And so what's happening is that there's a protest of the tactics and the strategies being used to enforce the immigration laws in Minnesota because they're operating in a sort of gray area. Right now, there's a disagreement specifically on when immigration can enter a home, whether it needs a administrative warrant or a judicial warrant. An administrative warrant is something that ICE can create on its own. A judicial warrant is something that a judge has to sign off on. That distinction is super important because the United States Constitution specifies that you can't have unreasonable search and seizures unless there's a probable cause shown and a warrant signed by a judge, right? That's the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. So that's one of the elements of the protest. The other element of the protest has to do with just the fact that ICE is there and that the city feels targeted because it is being targeted. Trump, in particular, stated that he's on a campaign of retribution against his political opponents, and he made it clear that Minnesota voted against him a whole bunch of times, and he didn't like that.
To clarify Mike's statement, according to a press release on the Minnesota Attorney General's website, President Trump made this clear himself on January 9th when he stated Minnesota is corrupt and crooked because its officials accurately reported election results and those results did not declare him the winner. That was a characterization of the president's motivation from January 12th, 2026, which Mike echoed. It can be found at https www.ag.state.mn.us office communications 2026-01-12 ICE ASP. Now back to the show.
And also, you have to think about the fact that Walz was the vice presidential candidate, so he was obviously an outspoken opponent of Trump and Vance, given that he called them notably weird, right? He called them on national television, he called Trump and Vance weird. And politics, at least the way Trump does politics, is personal. He doesn't forget things. This is one of those mechanisms that he's able to express his frustration and disagreement with the state of Minnesota. With that as the backdrop, Renee Good was engaging in protests of some of the ICE enforcement. In the process of engaging in that protest, her car was in the middle of a road and ICE was moving from one place to another. There's a video of the ICE agents leaving their cars, their vehicles, in the ice and the snow and approaching Renee Good's vehicle and instructing her conflicting instructions, actually, if you listen to the video. Two conflicting instructions go like this. One is go away, just leave, and the other is get out of your car. They both can't happen at the same time. You cannot both leave and get out of your car. So clearly there was some, let's call it a failure of leadership on the part of the law enforcement there, that they weren't speaking with one voice. There's a guy named Daniel Shaver a few years back. The cops got caught on him because he had an airsoft gun in I think it was like a motel or hotel, and he was shooting it out the window or something, and he was drunk. Cops show up. They give him competing instructions when he's unarmed, drunk, crawling on the ground, And the competing instructions, there's video of it, is pretty much sit up, sit down, sit up, sit down. I can't do both. His pants start falling down. He tries to pull up his pants. One of the cops shoots him in the face. He dies. He gets shot. He dies. Daniel Shaver. So this isn't new in law enforcement. This is not unique to federal law enforcement, that on occasion a lack of clear communication leads to people getting shot. And that's because police are armed, and the United States is a very heavily armed society. So when the cops received, in the case of Daniel Shaver, is what I'm thinking of, a report that a guy was armed with, it was an airsoft gun, but it looked like a very heavy weapon, right? They don't know. All they know is what they were told, that they're walking into a dangerous situation of someone armed. Because our society allows for cops to shoot people who they think pose a lethal threat, even if they appear unarmed, right, that any sudden movement can cause a lethal response. In the case of Renee Good, it was very unfortunate that the officer who was directly in front of her car had experienced a traumatic event with a car earlier in the year where he was dragged, I think it was 60 yards, and he had to get stitches when he reached into a car and the driver drove with the officer's arm in the car. And so he was more sensitive to sudden movements from cars. And so when there's all these conflicting instructions of, if you listen to the video of the officer saying, go away, get out of the car, it's not clear which one to do. It is clear that Renee Good starts her car and the car moves. And the problem with a moving vehicle is that it can be interpreted as a weapon. And if someone is very sensitive to the movement of a vehicle being interpreted as a weapon because it had been used as a weapon against them in the past, bad things can happen, okay? Really bad things. And the problem with the way that the law is worded, the way that officers can engage in lethal force, is that it's based on their own perception of threat, of what they perceive as something being lethal. The whole issue there is that absent an objective standard, right, of what constitutes acceptable threshold for lethal force, you get these varying standards. And in this case, the varying standard is that if you watch the video of the law enforcement officer, the car moves suddenly and he reacts, but it's not clear from people who watch after the fact. I watched a whole lot of angles of the video. It's not clear that at any point she's actually driving the car in his direction. It's simply that the car is starting and that she's turning to drive away, is what I saw. But I wasn't there, right? I wasn't right next to the car or in front of the car. I don't know. But the reason why there's protests and there's calls for an investigation is that when you have an investigation of this kind, of a lethal shooting or a use of a weapon by a cop, usually the investigation looks at every shot fired. Was that perception of being in mortal danger present for every time the gun was fired? Because if it was there the first time, okay, the investigation will show that he fired through the windshield because he thought the car was about to run him over. Maybe. But the time when he's out of the danger, when he's standing next to the driver's side window, definitely not in the path of the vehicle if you watch the video and there's distance, why are there multiple shots then fired into the car? That's the big question that I think a lot of people are definitely asking, is at what point does the cop stop firing for this perception of mortal danger? Because the way the law is worded is that they're allowed to fire, at least my understanding of the way the law is worded is they're allowed to fire if they perceive mortal danger for themselves or for others. And that's where it gets tricky, is that if you look at the video, there are other people around the car or near the car, other officers, and depending on how fast the cop perceived the car was accelerating, the concern would be hurting the other officers, right? Hurting the other people standing in the street. It's not just the officer. And that's where an investigation is super important. But either way, the underlying pretext, the big issue of why this even happened, is that cops in the United States are armed and that they're allowed to use lethal force against citizens and people, frankly, a threshold that isn't necessarily acceptable for vast swaths of the developed world. In other countries, the whole point is to never fire your weapon unless you absolutely have to. That there's a real effort being made for non-lethal means of apprehension, period. And in the case of a moving vehicle, it's very clear that there are standards and requirements for a lot of police departments in the United States that you never fire at a moving vehicle, period, because bullets don't stop. Bullets don't stop when you fire at a vehicle. They keep going until they hit something, right? And that's a huge issue aside from firing at the driver is that the bullets could have hit everybody else behind the car, right? The reason cops don't shoot at moving vehicles, same as they shouldn't be shooting on like a sidewalk or something full of people walking by, is that if someone gets away, you can apprehend them at a later time in a safer
Yeah.
location. When a bullet's fired in the middle of a protest, right, where there's people all around the car, if you watch the video, there's people behind the car, there's people on the sidewalks, there's someone briefly right next to the car on the passenger side door, right as the altercations, right before the altercations happening. There's people all around, right? Because this is a residential neighborhood and there's people filming and it's a protest. And so when you fire a moving bullet, it poses a risk to everybody, not just the driver of the car. And so that's why the policy usually is just never don't. It was a big deal actually in Washington State. They had to pass a law that said don't fire at fleeing people in cars because the bullets don't stop. It's the basic laws of motion, right? That something in motion won't stop until it's stopped by something else of equal or greater force. And bullets move fast and they go through all sorts of things people, property. So they pose a risk to everyone. And so that's why the sequence of events was troubling also for that reason. Look, there's actually a phrase, lawful but awful.
It's not a bad phrase.
It's a phrase that I heard while listening to the various interviews on this. I think it fits the situation. Even if one of the things was maybe legal, it's not clear that two of the shots were legal at all. The two when he's standing directly next to the car and out of the danger because the car's moving away from him. There's no chance that the car is suddenly going to transposition itself in a different direction when the wheel is turned and it's moving away. No chance. 0% chance. At that point, the firing should have stopped. All of those bullets pose a risk, not just to the driver, but everybody behind the car. Big issue. The reason that you have an investigation and the reason that there needs to be an investigation in this case is frankly, if this guy has such a huge reaction to a car moving in his direction because of the experiences maybe prior with a different car, that poses a real danger to everybody that interacts with this person if he's put back on the streets. And because of the nature of the enforcement tactics, these officers are walking up to cars, right? They're engaging in these tactics that are very risky, put it that way, because cars can in fact be used as weapons. There is an inherent risk in that. And so the problem here is that it's not so clear that they went through any kind of process or procedure to make sure that the officer got like mental health treatment or therapy or anything to ensure that he didn't have PTSD from the previous experience, such that his interpretation of events may have been like a heightened sense of fear, right? Or mortal peril, put it that way, because of being dragged by a car. The interpretation may not have been grounded fully in, let's call it reality, right? All the other officers didn't shoot. It was just him, right? The question becomes, why was it just him? And the argument would ultimately have to be, for some reason, he perceived some greater level of danger than the other people, such that he felt that his life was in immediate danger. We don't know. I don't know. I'm not a mind reader. But what I do know is that it looks really bad. There's no circumstances that law enforcement should be shooting protesters. Period. People have a First Amendment right to protest. In past times of protests, when it's happened, it was a huge moral tragedy. Kent State shooting of the protesters when they're shot by live ammo, they were unarmed. What's happening in Iran right now? If the standard is threats of military intervention for Iran because they're executing their protesters, why is it acceptable in any circumstance for law enforcement in the United States to engage in violent tactics against protesters? There's a hypocrisy there. And so the point is that the current situation is different because the tactics have become more heavy-handed, is the way to describe it, compared to past immigration enforcement actions. Part of the reason for that actually is just a matter of that they're creating a false urgency. So if you listen to how they talk about the people they're hunting down, it's, oh, these are criminals, bad people, etc., and so they need to be deported. But the problem with how they're describing it is that deportation and being in the country illegally, those are civil actions. They're administrative distinctions, right? Like, even if they have an order of removal, at most the government just deports people. They tell them to leave and then they kick them out. The level of enforcement and the tactics they're engaged in are so extreme and so over the top that I think that's why there's so many protests in Minnesota right now. Why the reaction is extreme on the other end, but is that essentially they're doing a dragnet, right? That they're just asking everybody for to prove their identity, essentially. And Americans aren't used to that level of authoritarianism in their lives. For the most part, the enforcement is what they're calling Kavanaugh stops. That if somebody has an accent or if they have a different skin color where they look like they could be Latino or from certain backgrounds that might have a greater number of undocumented immigrants, allegedly or as perceived, that they can stop them and demand their papers. But the real issue that I'm hearing, at least in that regard, is that ICE isn't believing at face value people's birth certificates or their ID cards, that there's some level of identification that is being questioned. That's not great, right? If a government issued identification isn't sufficient for the government to believe its own issued identification, what's sufficient? What do you need? Do we need
Yes.
biometrics? Do we need DNA? What do we need? Our eyes? I'm serious. What's enough? If they have that degree of skepticism when they are demanding identification, if the purpose is legitimate law enforcement, right, then they have to engage in a objective, neutral, professional manner for everybody, for how they're interacting. If the objective is something else to cause discord, disarray, chaos, confusion, this is how you would do it, right? And that's the big lingering question right now. Is the current enforcement action happening in Minnesota meant to goad the citizens of Minnesota into reacting in ways that exceed protected First Amendment speech or protest so that then Trump can declare the Insurrection Act, send in the military, declare martial law, and then we're living in no more elections because there's martial law, right? We're in a state of war.
France, 1815 to 1832. I'm interested to circle back here, complete the circle, you might say. When you say enforcement action, you're talking about the actions of ICE, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I say enforcement action, ICE,
Yeah.
ostensibly, what they're doing is they're simply going after people who have a criminal record or a order of removal, right? A final order of removal where they were told, somebody was told, you have to leave the country, and the person didn't leave, right? And so ICE, ostensibly, that's what they're saying, but you look at what people do, not what they say. But what they're saying they're
Exactly.
doing, the reason that they're there is twofold. One is investigating this childcare fraud to make sure that I'm not entirely certain what role ICE has in that of investigating the fraud. Maybe to investigate if undocumented immigrants are part of it. Who knows if they're receiving money from the federal government? Allegedly, I think that's what they might be looking into. But when I say enforcement action, what I mean is immigration and customs enforcement. So they're enforcing the immigration laws,
Yep.
meaning that if somebody has been told to leave by a court, the ICE is forcibly removing them, right? The issue, at least in this regard, is that it's a bit murky right now. There's a bit of a gray area because the Trump administration tried to stop all all asylum claims and all refugee claims. But international law is pretty clear that if somebody has a ongoing case of asylum and the United States is reviewing that case, that they shouldn't be deported from the United States. That's what was happening with that 5-year-old, is that his dad supposedly came into the United States through a port of entry and has an asylum case under review. And so he shouldn't be removed. That's my understanding of what the current law is. But it's murky. because the Trump administration has been trying to finesse that interpretation. If someone has an active asylum claim, that they don't have to stay in the country for their asylum claim to be reviewed and heard. That the Trump administration is trying to do that third country option of you send individuals to like Mexico or have you ever heard of the Remain in Mexico policy, where they
Yes.
shut the border down, shut ports of entry down, and people have to just remain in Mexico until they get
Yes.
their asylum. Same kind of deal here. Is that may be what's going on? Is that people with ongoing asylum claims no longer maybe have the protection that they thought they did of being able to remain in the country. And so the Trump administration is using ICE to forcibly remove people to anywhere else that will take them. If it's
Mhm.
their home country or if it's one of these third countries like Sudan, Rwanda, Uganda, Tini, there's a whole list of countries where people are being sent. El Salvador, that prison down in El Salvador, right?
Yeah, that one.
That's what I mean when I say enforcement action, though, is that they're going after undocumented individuals to deport them, to get them out of the country.
So now to complete the circle here, because I have been listening to all this on the news this whole time, but I haven't got a sort of total connected timeline of events, but which I got from you because I forget, like week to week, is oh, what's this about again? And I hear it just because I'm living, doing my job, caring for my daughters, and I used to be somebody who was very up on the news and very detail-minded, but then the things of life come at you and just fry your brain, but it's not totally gone, and you try to rebuild it. So what I'm trying to do is construct the total time here. So what you say is, because I heard about the alleged daycare fraud, and the daycare, like if there's fewer kids in the daycares, that might have to do with the fact that people are having fewer children than they did prior to the pandemic. And I'm not a scientist on these things, but I think that cost of living has something to do with it. But then, were there ICE protests prior to... What were the initial protests that Renee Good was at? What were those about?
Okay, so what was going on with Renee Good for the reason why she was there was that her community, and this is my understanding from reading the sequence of events, was that the neighborhood, the community that they were in, was actually participating in something called Ice Watchers, where effectively what they're doing is that they're going around with, it's like have you ever heard of a neighborhood watch? Where
Yes.
you see those signs that say, if you commit a crime in this neighborhood, we're going to call the cops, you're being watched, whatever. Same kind of deal here is it's a collective action to warn people. And so that's why you hear those whistles. If you've been watching any of these protests where you hear the whistles, what's going on is that these communities don't like that these enforcement actions are going on. As a way of protest, people are following ICE around and whistling. They're just indicating to people, hide, like ICE is on its way. It's like Paul Revere riding the horse. The British are coming. British are coming. Same kind of difference. Not same kind of difference. It's analogous of that kind of warning mechanism that they're serving as an early warning mechanism. So that's what was going on there. Where it got a little further in the case of Renee Good was that her car was in the road. That's where ICE reacted in the way they did because they viewed that as impeding their ability to move forward. Is my understanding of the events, is that they didn't like that the car was blocking their ability to move in a forward direction back to their headquarters or whatever, their staging area, their operation center. This is something I ran into, is that you have to be very careful not to block ingress and egress, that you have to allow people, if you're even on a public sidewalk, you have to not block people's ability to move from a place and to a place, right? To somewhere and from somewhere. So you can't block exits, you can't block entrances. You have to give wide berth, right? Of making sure you're not blocking the sidewalk itself. You can't stand in the way of anything. And so that's where it's escalated in that circumstance from being protesting on a sidewalk to blocking their ability to move. And I think that's where that interpretation came in. It went from being exercising one's First Amendment to being a crime. But there's a gray area there because it's not so clear that the car was actually impeding traffic because cars were able to drive around her. So the question becomes, could ICE have simply driven around her instead of engaging with her, of escalating that situation to demanding? That's where the big questions arise is, do they have a central command structure who is issuing commands in that situation? Do they have any kind of hierarchy of higher up, like a lieutenant or a supervisor that says, this is what we're doing, and then we do that? Because when you have conflicting instructions, it gets really confusing really fast, right? And not the problem with policing in America is that if a cop gives you an instruction that's a legal order or instruction you refuse, they can arrest you, right? You're obstructing the whatever, the peace, you're obstructing the arrest, you're obstructing whatever. You're doing something that is no longer protected speech. It's no longer like a protest if they give you a legal order, right? And that's where it gets really gray, morally gray in this situation. Because if she was blocking the road to such a degree that it rose to the level of being a crime, then they had every right as law enforcement to say, move, right? But that's the extent of what they could have done, is say, move. There is no circumstance where that results in execution. Nowhere in the US. They can instruct her. If she says no, they can arrest her. Okay? There is no policy, as far as I know, where her leaving the situation meant that they could then shoot at her unless she posed an immediate, imminent threat to the lives of one of the officers or to others. And that's where it gets complicated because that's open to interpretation. I think the vast majority of people who've watched the video and heard the video and seen the various elements of the video and the various angles of the before and the after, I think most reasonable people would arrive at the conclusion she didn't pose a threat to anyone. She was trying to drive away. That's it. The wheel was turned. The car was trying to drive away. It was moving at a snail's pace. Everybody around it had ample opportunity to just walk away, right? You don't need to stand in the way of a moving vehicle, right? That's a choice, right? And part of the issue, and this is where it does get really, not, well, frustrating is one way to describe it, is that there's a trend that's been documented of ICE officers standing in front of vehicles to then create a justification for utilizing more aggressive tactics as a response when a vehicle moves. It's not clear that's what was happening in this case, but it is clear that there is an opportunity, if the policy isn't strictly to stand way away from a vehicle, for there to be at least some ambiguity. And ambiguity is the place where opportunity of murder to occur. Because one of the problems with the United States is that at any given time, they've done studies on this, that at any given time, there's in the tens, if not the hundreds, of serial killers out and about. And one way to masquerade as a normal person is to become employed in a profession where you have contact with people. The examples I can think of are firemen who commit arson and then go and put out the fire to save the day, but in the process kill people. Bad. And then police officers, because there is a murky sort of gray zone for law enforcement. We talked about this in policing, where the opportunity to hurt people or to kill people 100% exists for cops in circumstances where it's unclear what the level of threat is, where it can be escalated and the cop can still get away with killing someone. So the example again I go to is Daniel Shaver, because the cop who shot him said that he thought Daniel Shaver was reaching for a gun in his waistband, and that cop was investigated, was put on trial, and was found not guilty. But if you watch the video of Daniel Shaver, he was visibly confused, he was visibly drunk, he was given conflicting instructions: keep your hands above your waist, keep your knees crossed. There were a whole bunch of instructions that were conflicting, and the cops warn him. They say, if you disobey our instructions, we will shoot you. That's unambiguous. But how do you obey two mutually exclusive things? You can't both lay on the ground and stand up at the same time.
Especially if you're intoxicated.
They found in the autopsy that he had 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his .27 BAC. So one would hope that cops wouldn't be executing drunk people simply because they're drunk and unable to fully comply with every instruction. But there's also just a failure of consistent communication of leadership, and that's a training thing. That's a policy thing, right? If they're not adequately, that's a failure of leadership of ICE and Homeland Security, and that goes way to the top. That goes to the president, and that goes to Kristi Noem, that they're not demanding that every law enforcement unit that's engaging in these enforcement actions has consistent communication, that they have a command structure that's unambiguous and clearly followed, right? That there's part of this issue is that they're hiring so many people and they're throwing so much money at this problem that it's like a slow moving train wreck. They're not putting in the work and the effort to make sure it's a professional, ethical, legal law enforcement operation. Because if you look at that journalist who showed up at like a hiring fair, she got hired in no time at all. She said, "I want to join ICE." They said, "Okay, fill out some of these forms," and boom, they offered her to get hired. And it's okay. Where's the background check? Where's the drug test? Where's the psyche eval? Like, where are all these things that you would expect at a bare minimum before you hand somebody a gun? Pilots, if they visit, like, pilots have strict mental health requirements before they can ever get into a cockpit of a plane. Because if you don't have those strict mental health requirements, psyche evals and therapy, then you have situations like that pilot who was depressed and flew into a mountain, right? Like, the whole point is, why are our standards for hiring these people and employing them? Because we ultimately are the ones paying them, right? We are the American taxpayer who's the one that is paying for our own getting gassed and tased and shot at for some of the protests. I mean, that taxpayers are paying for it. Why is there such a low bar to a barrier to entry? Yeah, why is there such a low bar for entry? Other countries, they spend 2 years training their cops, 3 years. Strict requirements. You take a whole bunch of classes. You have to pass a whole bunch of tests. You can't just be handed a gun and go out in the world enforcing the law. For the training for this, it doesn't look like there's all that much. Just doesn't look like there's all that much at all. And it's very confusing because like, how do I phrase this? Have you ever heard the phrase, "Who watches the Watchmen"?
Yes.
Who's ensuring that all these people out there with guns and the ability to use force to enforce the law are doing it in a ethical, legal, professional way? If the moment this happens, the president and the head of ICE come out and say, "Oh, it was totally justified, nothing to see here," and then they don't do an investigation, what is going on there? These we're supposed to expect the highest ethical standards, right? Because they expect everybody to follow the law, and those who don't have a law enforcement enforce the law against them. But it doesn't work in reverse. That the laws for torture and murder and kidnapping and theft. To give you an example of something that I found troubling is there was a kid who had his phone taken, and then he did find his phone after he got snatched, and his phone had been stolen, had sold it was either like a pawn shop or a phone store. And wait a second, some of these cops are stealing and selling property. What's that about? And so that this is one of those things where it's like, who is actually maintaining any kind of ethical standard or professionalism for all the law enforcement? What's going on? Do they not have internal affairs? Because other police departments, they have people who investigate corruption, bribery. I know the Seattle Police Department was under a consent decree for a long time because of the policing tactics that they were using. Why is that not happening here? What's going on? And so that's part of the issue of this moment. And when you ask what are the protesters protesting, that's one of the things, is this lack of just general basic competency and professionalism. Why are they charging through these neighborhoods, breaking windows, breaking down people's doors, using gas, firing rubber bullets at people and blinding them? Why? Is that really how you're supposed to enforce the law? Did the Obama administration deported an awful lot of people? I don't remember there being story after story of just like wildly outrageous police tactics of tear gassing people and shooting them with rubber bullets and breaking their windows in their cars. It just seems like there's been an order from on high to be way more aggressive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so it seems like in response to my question of what are the protesters' objectives, what do they want, what sort of outcome that they would see, would they be satisfied with? It seems that in response to that, there's a lot of stuff. The imbalance of force, the giving people who we do not believe have been evaluated properly or trained properly, the force of law, the baton, so to speak. When we know a guy who wanted to be a cop, and he went through a lot of evaluations or something, and at one point he was like, oh yeah, I downloaded music illegally once, because he was trying to be honest or something, and according to him, that's what got him kicked out of the whole thing. But then there was this other person who wanted to join the LAPD, but he would get evaluated, and the thing ended up being was that, like, he probably had some deep-seated anger issues. I met the guy a few times. He seemed all right, whatever. But the point is, in my experience, you evaluate people a lot before you give them a weapon and the power of law. And just...
Yeah, I'm honestly really curious the amount of scrutiny that all of you, because they're hiring a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I'm just very curious what actual amount of scrutiny for any of these hires they're doing when they hire them. Are they even running a background check? Are they forking over the money for a drug test? Are they making sure that they don't have a criminal record or any issues of mental health or domestic violence in their past? But then the other question is, how much scrutiny are they getting when they have the job? Are they regularly getting a mental health check, any kind of therapy? Do they have access to these resources? Or is this just part of the chopping block of the Trump administration of just cutting all of these things, like the inspectors general, and when they tried to they tried to cut $2 billion of the substance abuse money for all those nonprofits, and everybody panicked. They're like, you're about to shut down all this mental health treatment stuff overnight. What are you doing? Don't do that. But because the reason I asked that is if you listen to the video of the ICE agent, somebody, it's not clear if it was him, says fucking bitch after Renee Good gets shot. And the question there becomes, was that
Jesus.
was that misogyny? Was that some kind of
Something.
revenge? Because in the video, the agent gets taunted by one of the protesters. It's not clear. I'm not sure who it was, but they essentially taunt the agent for videotaping the license plate of the car. And then the agent goes from being taunted, and then a few minutes later shoots Renee Good a 3 or 4 times. It's not clear the exact number, but enough times that she ends up ultimately dying. And the question becomes then, was he at risk of his life, or was it misogyny? It was like, this woman taunted me and I have to take revenge on that. Because one thing I do know for a fact is that the rates of domestic abuse are higher in law enforcement.
It's very unfortunate. One becomes more aggressive when taunted in a certain way. It's like a physiological thing.
There's a reason there's cause for an investigation, because if the motive wasn't self-defense, right? If the motive wasn't to stop the car from being a weapon that could kill him or others, if it was actually like misogyny or revenge for being maybe emasculated, right, of being goaded or criticized, that's a whole different kettle of fish. That's straight up violence against, like, murder. That's violence against women, like manslaughter or murder, like crime, big crime. And so that's why I do think there needs to be an investigation of what happened with Renee Good. Just, they need an investigation. If charges are warranted, they should charge him. That's just the way that the system works. But that's not happening. The one other thing that irks me about what happened with Renee Good, if you watch the videos and the sequence of events and the timeline, is that after Renee Good was shot and drove into it was like a car or a pole, her vehicle drove to the side of the street and she was no longer driving because she was obviously shot and bleeding, is that someone tried to render aid. A witness, one of the people from the neighborhood, claimed he was a doctor and tried to check her pulse and render aid, as one might do if they're a medical professional, and was prevented from doing so. And the claim was from the person who prevented them that they had their own medics and the medics were on the way. But the problem with someone bleeding out to death, if you ever read about battlefield medicines or why they had a medic with units at all times, is that the window of opportunity to try and staunch the bleeding is very limited. Of preventing
Yes.
somebody. Renee Good was still alive at that time if she still had a pulse, and there was the possibility of stopping her from dying if she wasn't actually dead at that time, and they prevented the medical aid from being rendered. Then there's another crime that happened, which was that they didn't render aid, that they insured death. Does that make sense? That if somebody
Yeah.
could have had access to medical treatment and didn't get it, because remember, law enforcement's required, even if someone's a hardened criminal or whatever, they're required to render aid to pretty much anybody after a violent incident. Because if somebody's being arrested, guess who they're in the custody of? They're in the custody of the government. At that point, the state has an obligation legally to provide medical treatment and healthcare because the person's they no longer have the freedom to seek it for themselves, right? That they can't, if they have the ability to go to the hospital, they're not allowed to leave because law enforcement has them in custody, right? That's the whole problem there. And so there's a whole different ethical and moral quandary going on for why weren't those people being investigated or charged for denying medical treatment and aid to Renee Good. And that's a whole separate discussion of, because it's not so clear that it was the person who shot Renee Good that prevented the administering of aid. But what is clear is that somebody claimed to be a doctor and wanted to provide immediate medical treatment in the aftermath of the shooting and was not allowed to do. And that when the EMS showed up, they weren't even allowed to drive up the ambulance to the scene. They had to carry her by hand, pull her out of the vehicle, and carry her to the ambulance. So these kinds of delays pretty much make it much more difficult to actually save somebody if they're not given timely medical treatment. So that's a whole different issue, but it's definitely an issue. And it's not just Renee Good with that we see this happening. Do you remember that video of the double tap that they're not releasing because it allegedly shows people who are floundering in the water after a ship got blown up?
The fishing boat?
Yeah, the fishing boat. That the military unambiguously is not supposed to fire upon shipwrecked people. Period. No circumstances. There's no instance where they're allowed to do that. It's in their war manual. And so the question becomes, is there just a total... This is where it's so mind-bogglingly hypocritical that the justification for harming these people in these circumstances of blowing up the boats, of harming the protesters, is that the law is being broken. But it doesn't seem to work reciprocally, that if the government breaks the law, or it looks like the government's breaking the law, they're not investigating themselves and holding the people who do these things accountable. Maybe because the orders go right up to the top. Is that it? That there's some kind of immunity or impunity involved? Because for Trump, I can understand, because the Supreme Court a ruling that said that Trump's pretty much immune from all prosecution if he can claim that it was something that the president does. And technically, in an official capacity. And technically, law enforcement is an official duty of the president to make sure that the laws are faithfully executed. Obviously, there's some interpretation there, right, as to which laws are enforced, because there are laws against torture, against murder, against depraved heart. Do you know what depraved heart is?
I do not. That's the first time I'm hearing that.
So depraved heart or depraved indifference is when somebody in an official capacity should do something and doesn't. So, for example, if somebody's a nurse and they see somebody who's diabetic, who needs insulin, and they watch somebody suffering from a sort of a diabetic shock, and they have insulin on hand, and they don't provide that insulin in their official capacity as a nurse, that's depraved indifference, that they have the ability to help somebody, they have the obligation to help somebody, they choose not to. Let me make sure that I'm getting that right for what the definition of that is. Yeah, so it's a form of murder involving an unintentional killing caused by acting with extreme recklessness or a callous disregard for human life. So, what that means, so let me give you an example of where this may have applied. So, when the guy shoots Renee Good, say that one of those bullets did go past the car and hit one of the protesters, and the protester died. That's a reckless indifference, right? Or disregard for human life because the protester who would have gotten shot had no involvement in the interaction other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So the whole point is that if a depraved heart is one of those things where it's a disregard for human life, right? So let me think of another example that might make sense. Say there's flooding in a prison, right? And a prison guard has a key to unlock the doors to the prison. And instead of unlocking the doors to the prison when there's flooding, the prison guard just leaves, right? Leaves all the prisoners in a flooding or flooded prison. The prisoners can't get out. They're trapped in cells, right? So anyways, that's something that I'm surprised isn't being investigated more for the aftermath of the Renee Good incident was being denied medical treatment because that is not acceptable morally. It's not right. But anyways, sorry, I'm just
Sure.
we're living in strange times. Let's put it that way. But what I do know is that it's currently not safe, apparently, to film ICE to their face, or even in their proximity. And so people need to devise ways to film them without being seen or without being like physically proximate to them on the street or the sidewalk.
Or let us perhaps put that in more strategic terms. If it is dangerous to film a powerful organization, then the logical thing to do would be to film them without their knowledge.
Yeah, so people have a right to film cops going about their jobs in an official capacity on the street or the sidewalk. Same for ICE. People have a First Amendment right to. This has been my understanding is that this has been adjudicated that people do in fact have a right to film. It's just that there is a clear and present danger for protesters to film with with it being known, right? And yeah, I think people, if they want to bear witness, need to be more creative. One way I think is the press does it is to just call yourself a local reporter and wear like a press badge or like a act like you're in a war zone and wear like the press jacket or the some way of identifying that you're press because the press isn't supposed to be interfered with, period. But even then, that may not be a defense. But what I do know is that clearly, given the circumstances right now, is there is a real danger, a real risk for all protesters who are filming if they're seen, because I guess it's being viewed as impeding or something, or they don't want to have witnesses to them engaging in their lawful enforcement action. That's where I'm a little unclear as to why there's such a gripe with being filmed doing the job. Because remember, they are paid by us. Ostensibly, we are all fractionally their bosses because the taxpayers pay for their services. I don't know. It's confusing.
It reminds me of that Simpsons episode where George H.W. Bush says, "My bosses are going to like this." Yeah, all 300 million of them.
We're living in strange times for sure. Oh, that's the one sequence of events I didn't mention. Is a bunch of prosecutors. This is a trend in the second Trump administration of prosecutors in the Department of Justice just all resigning en masse. Remember the Eric Adams case where they all just resigned? They're like, no. And now in this one, the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota, a whole bunch of prosecutors all just quit. They said, no, we're not going to do this. We're not going to investigate the wife of this woman who was shot to death by a federal agent, and this is wrong. There's no real moral ambiguity here. This is wrong. That you're instructing us to do this instead of investigating the shooting itself. And yeah, no, there are profiles encouraged if you know where to look of people who are using their official roles and their powers within their own jobs and employment to say this is wrong and they're taking a stand. They're resigning in protest, right? Which is a big deal. These are not low paid jobs. These are highly skilled professionals who, to be a lawyer, right? There's a reputational cost. If somebody's a prosecutor, in one case, I think it was 20 years as a federal prosecutor, like second in command in the office, there is a real reputational cost to resigning in that manner because odds are very low. They're going to get hired back by the federal government for any law job if they quit and submitted a resignation to the person who would be hiring them.
Yeah.
That there is a real risk. But yeah.
Sure, yeah, and becoming a lawyer is a difficult thing. I thought that somebody just had to pass the bar, but at least in Washington, in order to take the bar, you need to, have a Juris Doctorate or there's some other
there's two ways. You go to there's two ways. You go to law school or you apprentice for a long period of time to a lawyer who will vouch for you. But that one takes a long time.
It's a significant investment, and it's very in terms of time and cost. And so the cost, if it's similar in Minnesota, would be quite a bit. So thanks for that summary of the issues at play in Minnesota. I have heard on the news, both sides are calling for calm, or led by both sides, I would mean Tim Walz and J.D. Vance. I don't know if Trump's calling for calm. I actually just haven't seen Walz and J.D. Vance. But it doesn't seem there haven't been reforms as a result of this, and far be it from me in a protest to say, why quit now? And I won't say that. But, I don't know, because you lay out the issues skillfully. And I just think to myself, I think the cold weather's coming to Minnesota, and they'd say, oh, no, cold weather's not coming, it's been here, eh? Oh, sorry, that's Canada, but similar region. But the cold weather's coming, and lately I've been thinking that there has been the language of the need for change very present in our lives, in our spheres, for some time. Like 1 decade at absolute minimum. 11, 12 years at absolute minimum. And it's been there for longer. And it's like that has become a commonplace fixture of everything. And I think, what reforms really come about?
Oh, I have one that would immediately change things, is to disarm virtually all law enforcement and force them to come up with non-lethal ways to detain people. Because remember, law enforcement is ostensibly, everybody is presumed innocent until they're proven guilty. How do you prove someone guilty? You have to charge them with a crime and put them on trial and have a jury of their peers convict them. And so the judge, jury, executioner part of the sequence can't exist if you remove the tools for execution. And honestly, I think that our democracy would be well served if virtually all domestic law enforcement just wasn't armed, period, except in the most extreme circumstances. And even then, that it has to be like unambiguous why they're using a gun. I understand that it would be a huge shift, right? That maybe the focus on defense would be very expensive if they're armed head to toe in like Kevlar or something, and that they have to use like tasers or Jello or gummy worms or something. I don't know. Imagine if every time they apprehended someone, they used some kind of like Batman trap of Ebola or glue or something to just stop someone from moving. Or did you ever watch Guardians of the Galaxy?
Yes, I did see that.
Do you remember the scene where they freeze the person in place with like a tractor beam?
I don't. I don't think I recall that much from that movie.
Oh, okay. There's a scene in the movie where they're in a highly advanced society, and the cops aren't really armed, but what they have is a ship, and the ship has a beam that freezes somebody in place. They can't move. Honestly, if someone wants to save a lot of lives, they should become innovative and invent a way of apprehending people without killing them. It's not a great look for people that we pay to enforce the law to be killing citizens in any scenario. It's not great. The number of people who die in law enforcement actions in any given year should be zero, right? Like, it should be a big fat zero.
Yeah, yeah. People know about Target Zero. How about this for a Target Zero? That's just a reference.
I don't know the reference, but that's okay.
The reference is that they don't want any DUI deaths, and which laudable goal. But also, how about this for a Target Zero deaths here?
It was a tragedy. It was very sad. I wish that there was an investigation, because part of government is truth seeking, just to arrive at a version of the truth that people can agree is the truth. And that if there is no investigation, there's always this lingering question of whether the shooting was justified or not. And also, if the person who did it poses a continuing risk to the public, because it's not clear if what happened was a result of like extreme traumatic reaction to a car moving. And the problem is, the course of doing the job, they're going to interact with cars. If they keep doing this job, if they haven't been fired or resigned or put on leave, like, they will continue interacting with moving vehicles and the people inside those vehicles. And if the reaction was so extreme simply from a vehicle starting or moving even just a little bit in their direction, that's why I think an investigation is really important.
Yes. Let's investigate and find out what we need to find out. So, Facebook Marketplace murder. On NBC News, it was reported that this person went to sell a cell phone. It turned into a robbery where they took the phone. Who's going to rob somebody for a phone? They just do the cost-benefit analysis, criminals. Jeez.
Some phones are pretty expensive these days. They go over $1,000.
Sure, but robbing somebody for assets of only $1,000, yes, it's a pretty penny, but you risk going to jail. You can make that money
but apparently
in other ways.
It was teenagers who were the ones that orchestrated this. And when you're at that age, they don't have fully developed brains and mental faculties to weigh the costs and the benefits.
Yeah. They just act on instinct.
Yeah. Part of it, too, may have been opportunistic, though. So if it was a higher valued asset, the person selling it may have used more caution or brought a weapon or something to the interaction themselves to defend themselves, like a car or something. It may have been one of those things where it was a crime of opportunity, that the value wasn't so high that somebody would defend it with their life, but it wasn't so low that they wouldn't show up, if that makes sense. It was just enough for somebody to show up and want to sell it at the price that they were trying to sell it for.
I guess I'll put my questions here. The questions are, do sellers need a license? Number 2, hasn't the internet made it a more dangerous world with stuff like this? And then the other one I'll ask, is selling things online worth it? What do you think?
So for the license thing, generally, I don't think so, because people do garage sales all the time, right? It's where they sell stuff from their garage and negotiate a price down from whatever their stated price is. Like, that's very commonplace that people
garage sale,
do a garage sale, where cities have as a tourism thing where they have the great big garage sale, right? Everybody does a garage sale at the same time. And so people drive around looking for deals. It's pretty common. But no, unless you're a wholesaler, right? You have a lot of stuff and you're selling it in a store or something, or as a business, maybe then, yeah, you probably need a business license, right? If you're a corporation. But for something at this magnitude, 1 or 2 things, like, people go to pawn shops, they go to thrift stores, they go to, do you remember Half Price Books?
Oh, it still exists. Yeah, I love Half Price Books.
Yeah, where you go and you sell your old books and your old games and CDs and stuff. Like, people do that.
I assumed that those retailers that bought then had a license. That was my assumption.
So buyers, because they both buy and sell, right? It's a thing. But no, I don't. Maybe it would help if they had licenses, because there would be a barrier, but I don't know. This is one of those things where it seems like a freedom of association and speech thing. If you want to sell something to someone, that's capitalism, the land of opportunity, right? If you can find someone willing to buy the thing you want to sell, but I'm not 100% on that, because I do know for some places, like, if you want to sell lemonade, you need a food license permit, and you need a business license to sell the lemonade. So it could be different based off of the different things that you're trying to sell, because there may be requirements, like reporting requirements or regulatory requirements for the things you're selling. So if you sell food, you generally have to have a food handler's permit. If you're selling hazardous chemicals or something, that you generally have to have some kind of reporting that you have to do to, I don't know if it's the EPA or something, like someone has to know that you're transporting or dealing with very harmful chemicals or toxic chemicals. But I don't know. It seems like on a case by case basis in terms of whether someone needs a license to sell something. In this case, I'm not so sure, right? A cell phone is something that is transferable. Same with things like video games, furniture, books. There's all sorts of products where it doesn't seem like you would need a license to sell it. Okay.
What about danger to the world?
Yeah, for the other stuff. So the world's always been dangerous. What the internet has done is created more opportunities for danger to collide with the less dangerous, right? There's always been theft, there's always been burglary, there's always been piracy, there's always been crime in general. What the internet does is it provides the opportunity for things like fraud and things like putting people in touch who otherwise may never have encountered each other. So I'm thinking in particular of like the Tinder serial murderers and the Craigslist murderers and the circumstances where someone says they're selling something, but they're not, or they're selling something different than what they stated, right? It creates an opportunity that otherwise doesn't exist to increase the likelihood of an encounter. That's the main thing of what the internet has done with respect to crime, is that it creates more opportunity for criminals to actually successfully perpetrate their crimes, right? Because they find marks for their crimes easier than having to go out and look for them because the marks come to them.
Cool, thanks. That's a good explanation. Who's the leader of the free world now? Is it Canada? Is it France? Who is it?
I guess it depends on your definition of free, right? Because no one in any sovereign country is truly free in any meaningful sense of the word, because they're always subject to the law, right? They're always subject to the whatever the legal systems and authorities are within those countries. That's sovereignty in a nutshell.
They're not free like a pirate, but I think we know what we mean by free.
Yeah, but if we're talking about freer in the sense of like respecting human rights, it's all relative, but respecting human rights, civil liberties, respecting human dignity, and making sure that people are treated with respect and not gassed and shot in the face. I'd say France or Canada are both good competitors, but France right now still is the leader of all things free in the civilized world, in the Western world. They're way up there just because of the way that their political system operates.
What about Carney? He speaks French.
Yeah. Look, the only thing I'd say for Canada is that they're still technically part of the Commonwealth. Even if it's a symbolic monarch, they still have a monarch. Mm-hmm. France is freer in the sense that it's more of a democracy, if that makes sense. More of a democratic republic because they don't have a monarchy anymore. To my knowledge, I don't think the French Republic has a monarchy. No, they don't.
But some people say that the King of France is bald because that office is vacant, and therefore, is it true? Is it a true statement? Is it a false statement? That's a common thing in philosophy as far as semantics goes. But no, France currently has no monarchy.
So between those two, ultimately, even if it's just by a little slim margin, France is freer than Canada. Because Canada, they've got like a special office for the monarchy that has to, I don't know if they have to do approval for the prime minister. There's something
Governor General, you're thinking of...
Yeah, the Governor General, like they have an actual role for someone within the monarchy in government, which is not free-ish because the monarchy isn't really elected. It's just there. So the fact that still exists in some capacity means that while Canada does have a lot of democracy and it's got a lot of great stuff, the healthcare, and they got some great social policies, and they're mostly really advanced in terms of their like social cohesiveness, they're still not as democratic as a country without a monarchy. That's my take on that.
All right. That's your take. That's why it's called Mondays with Mike.
Yeah. But no, I don't know if Germany has a king, actually. Does Germany?
No.
Then Germany and France right now, they're up there in terms of the freest. Or it would be actually Norway has a king. I think Sweden has a king. Does Finland have a king? I don't know. Denmark has...
I don't remember.
I think Belgium has a king. There's a lot of monarchies still around Europe.
There are a lot of monarchies. Yeah, they're having... I don't know. Royal figurehead, maybe it makes them more free, or less free, maybe not. But, okay, cool. Quick question, quick answer.
Okay. Although I'd say Australia's pretty the free, no, they're still part of the Commonwealth, but because they have the mandatory voting where everybody has to vote, so they have the most direct democracy in terms of.
Oh, interesting. So that's like a paradox, too, because it's like a compulsion to vote, which is a law that you must do something. But you're saying that would then result in more freedom, in effect.
It affords them more of a say. Actually, no, let me step back on that. That's not as free, right? Because choosing to not participate in the system is in and of itself a choice born of freedom, right? Like choosing to be neutral, to stay out of the fray entirely. Okay, I'm wrong. It's probably France. France is up there.
Probably France.
Probably. All right.
All right. We'll leave it there. Cool. Mondays with Mike.